Now to tomorrow's testimony by former special counsel Robert Mueller before the House Judiciary and Intelligence Committees. Let's bring in a member of the Judiciary Committee, Democratic Congressman David Cicilline of Rhode Island. And Congressman, what are the questions that you hope will be asked, that you plan to put to the table that will help American voters and the American people better understand what happened? And is it potentially your point of view that this could be a difficult road in terms of what those questions might be and what exactly the answers are that you could get?
Well, I think it's important that Mr. Mueller make it clear to the American people that he did not exonerate the president from the offenses of obstruction of justice, that obstruction of justice is a serious charge that really strikes at the core of our judicial system, and then that he walked the American people through the actual evidence, that he found that the president directed the White House counsel to fire the special counsel. Then he directed him to lie about it and even generate a fake document, a report to memorialize that lie. That he instructed a third party, Corey Lewandowski, to go tell the Attorney General to tell the special counsel to limit his investigation to future presidential elections and not look at the 2016. So those are two examples of obstruction of justice. I think during the hearing you will hear Mr. Mueller walk the American people through the report. We should be asking him questions to bring that report to life so the American people can understand and see the very serious misconduct of the president. This will be the first time that most of the American people will have an opportunity to really hear about the conclusions of the report, the evidence that Mr. Mueller collected, and the serious wrongdoing of the president. So I think you'll see a very sober hearing where people understand the gravity of the moment, but where the facts of what the report concluded and found during the course of the investigation are fully revealed to the American people.
Hey there,
Karine Jean-Pierre.
Yes, thanks, Mika. Hey there, Congressman. This is Karine. Good to see you. My question to you is that, so on Sunday, we saw your chair, Nadler, basically mention high crimes and misdemeanors as it relates to Donald Trump's behavior, and with what he's done in this administration. But also, you guys clearly are going to have Mueller tomorrow. Does this get us closer to impeachment inquiries? What does this mean? What will be the outcome after tomorrow?
Well, I think it will certainly change some of my colleagues' minds on this question of whether or not the time has come to open a formal impeachment inquiry. I've said that several months ago. There's more than sufficient evidence in the Mueller report to warrant the formal beginning of a process to consider whether or not the president committed high crimes and misdemeanors and whether articles of impeachment should be filed. I think it will depend in large part on the response of the American people to this. I mean, I have been saying, look, I think we have a duty to move forward with an inquiry. We took an oath of office. We are the only branch that can hold this president accountable. Mr. Mueller actually makes that point at the very concluding paragraphs of the report. So I think this will be a very sobering moment. I think it's going to be, this report is damning. The evidence is overwhelming. And I think when the American people fully understand it, it will increase the calls for the beginning of a formal impeachment process.
You know, Keir, a portion of both hearings tomorrow, the Judiciary Committee and then the Intelligence Committee hearing, apparently, clearly, the Republicans intend to go at the roots of the Russia investigation. Yeah. Was the FBI complicit in hoking things up and stuff like that? I would expect that Bob Mueller, the former director, will really push back on that. Yeah. But the roots of the Russia investigation, you have been on this story for more than a couple of years now. What's your sense of what ought to be asked or what you think they'll go for?
Well, my takeaway from the Mueller inquiry report was obviously one as a foreign correspondent. And what I was struck by was the lack of information on the Russian side. And that's not surprising because it was very difficult to get any Russians to actually give any evidence. And we had that that fascinating insight that President Putin meets with something like 50 oligarchs on a regular basis to kind of give them directions. I thought that was really interesting. But at the same time, I felt like aside from the redacted redacted elements of the report. There were lots of black holes, if you like, which were simply there because you only had half the story, in a sense. Congressman, I want to ask you about Bob Mueller's testimony tomorrow. Isn't there a danger for the Democrats? I mean, there's no evidence that Mr. Mueller wants to side politically with the Democrats, if you like. He wants to walk a line. Isn't there a danger for the Democrats that tomorrow ends up handing President Trump another political win as Mr. Mueller walks that line and doesn't deliver the kind of damning indictment that the Democrats are hoping for?
I don't actually think there is. I think the four corners of the report contain explosive and damning evidence of the misconduct of this president, 10 specific instances of obstruction of justice. I think everyone expects Mr. Mueller to limit his testimony to the contents of the report, but the report is in and of itself provides substantial evidence of presidential wrongdoing. So again, I think you will see the Democrats walk the special counsel through the contents of his report and really bring those contents to life for the American people. You'll see the Republicans attack the origins of the report, the character of the FBI, maybe even the character of Mr. Mueller. I think that's what you'll see from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. But I think so long as people watch this hearing with an open mind, you will hear Mr. Mueller go through the findings of his report, and they're really compelling and very disturbing conclusions about the conduct of the president that I think any fair-minded person would conclude warrant a formal impeachment inquiry.
Congressman David Cicilline, thank you very much for being on the show this morning. And still ahead on Morning Joe, two Democrats who both made recent trips to the border, Senator Dick Durbin and Congresswoman Lauren Underwood, join us. The big question for them, should Democrats really be negotiating with an administration whose policies they find so abhorrent? You're watching Morning Joe. We'll be right back.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.